Hello, friends. I'm back. You might not have known I'd gone anywhere, but I've basically been off for about 3 months, extended paternity leave with the birth of my second child. But in a way that's more relevant to today's episode, I've kind of been away from myself. Or another way to put it is my heart and mind have not been in alignment for a couple of years, and they've, I think, just gotten back into alignment somewhat recently. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Because almost all internal conflicts can basically come down to this heart versus mind dilemma. Your thoughts want one thing, your feelings want something else. Yes, there are times where you might have conflicting thoughts and conflicting feelings, but this is typically what's going on inside of us, this split between rationality and feeling and emotion. And what's interesting is that in many ways, this internal conflict maps to the external conflict of a typical hetero relationship. Usually when a man and a woman are fighting, when they're in a relationship, it's usually the man's thoughts versus the woman's feelings, or maybe a better way to put it is the man justifies his feelings using his thoughts, and the woman justifies her thoughts using her feelings. So we're gonna look at this as a model of how do you solve this internal dilemma, because both of these things that we're abstracting as your heart versus your mind, they're sense-making mechanisms that are supposed to help you navigate reality. And when they are in conflict with each other, obviously it becomes very difficult to do anything well. So in this episode, we're going to talk about how to solve the heart versus mind dilemma, to find synergy between these parts or aspects of your psyche so that you can navigate reality as one whole unit. Before we jump in, a couple of quick announcements. The Masculine Archetype Challenge, which is my 21-day program based in Jungian psychology to help a man connect to his testosterone-driven instincts, is still available. It still comes with a one-on-one coaching session with me, but the new thing is based on a request actually from one of the students who just did his one-on-one with me. He asked if we would do a cohort again, meaning, go through the 21 lessons together as a group with a group call in the beginning and at the end. So based on this request, I'm going to do that. Basically, if you have signed up for the Masculine Archetype Challenge or you're planning on signing up basically before we start, which will probably be a week or two after this episode comes out. I don't know the exact date because I record these in advance, but if you go to ruwando.com/archetype, there should be a little announcement bar at the top saying exactly when the cohort starts. If you join before then, or if you've already joined, you can join in on the group calls. We're going to do one in the beginning, one at the end. And if there's demand for it, if there's desire for it, we may continue those bi-weekly calls as like kind of an accountability / group coaching group, which I would also incorporate something new I've been working on, which is mindful fitness, a mindful fitness program with certain esoteric practices. So if you follow me on Instagram, maybe you've been seeing I've been posting a little bit more about some of the mind-body fitness stuff I've been learning. I've been framing this as what I call my Train by Elements protocol. Basically, I use the metaphor of the four elements to represent certain neurotransmitters that drive our behavior, but also athleticism and aspects of our psyche, if you will. So if you're interested in that, links are going to be in the description. One more quick announcement. As I mentioned in the intro, this internal heart versus mind dilemma does seem to map to the external man-woman relationship or the typical conflict there. And in the last couple of months, a few guys in committed relationships with young kids have reached out to me with various, needs for help with their relationship. So I decided to, in terms of the actual external relationship, I decided to create a group program specifically for men in committed relationships, which typically means you're raising children with your partner. It's a group coaching program. It's meant to basically get a bunch of guys who are in similar life situations who want to learn how to lead their family in a way where you have polarity and harmony and get to be a man, but also a man that serves your family well. So if you're interested in that, there's an application in the description of this episode. I'm going to keep it to a very small group of guys in a similar life situation. And actually over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be sharing basically all the content that I feel like is important for a man who wants to create a happy, healthy household and lead his family in that way. So if you want to apply to that, that is in the episode description. All right, so jumping into the episode, there's 3 parts to this. We're going to speak about what I'm calling distortions of the heart and mind and how to fix them, empowering the heart and mind, and a more metaphorical idea that is coming from Buckminster Fuller known as synergy. So this first thing, distortions, right? So if we think of our heart and mind as sense-making mechanisms, right? Our heart, or what drives our feelings and our feeling-driven behavior, comes from our paleo-mammalian brain. I won't go too deep into the science. I tend to like to nerd out on this stuff, but it's basically a much older mechanism that through our 5 senses, it interprets the world or interprets the data that our 5 senses gives us and gives us these feelings that drive our behavior, right? This is something we have largely in common with most social mammals, let's say. And where our head is something similar, but is something more unique to humans, right? Our thoughts, right? Interprets data from a more conscious level and gives us a rational bit of information on how to proceed with our lives. Now, since these two mechanisms in our brain evolved at very different times, right, in terms of evolution, they're basically separate, right? They have the same goal, which is the betterment of the individual, right? It interprets the information from your five senses to ideally give you impulses or ideas of what to do to navigate reality to live a happy and fulfilled life, right? But because they evolved at different times, they sometimes are in conflict. And one way I like to think of it, just as as a simple metaphor, it's like if you think of your mind as, say, a camera, and your heart as, say, or your feelings, let's say, as like a microphone, right? They're both interpreting reality, but they're interpreting different parts of reality. So if you're only looking at one or the other, they might give you a different idea of what to do in a given situation or what decision to make in a certain moment of conflict or dilemma. So I said in the intro that for a couple of years, my heart and mind have basically been kind of out of sync, and it's caused me to make some pretty bad decisions, bad life decisions, or navigate my life in not a good way because I wasn't using my heart and mind in the right way, and they were kind of at odds for a while. And I won't go through all of it, but usually when someone tells a story in the beginning of like an advice episode, usually it follows like a hero's journey formula, right? Like here's where things were when they weren't so good, and then I discovered this thing. I met some mentor. He gave me some information, and the result is this awesome thing, right? In marketing, they call it an epiphany bridge. You share how you had some epiphany that bridged the unpleasant scenario to the pleasant scenario. I wish I could tell a story like that. Mine is a little bit reversed. It's a little bit backwards because for reasons that I was totally unconscious of, my heart and mind were very much in sync for a while, and it was showing and I'll say in my work life, but also in my personal life. My heart was very happy because I was expressing myself in a very authentic way. I'm thinking like maybe 5 years ago or so, my podcast really started taking off. And it wasn't because I followed some marketing formula or someone's checklist on how to be successful. I was really coming from my heart. I was sharing things that I felt were important. I was, just Facebook live streaming into my Facebook group and talking about whatever I felt was useful or interesting. And my head was also happy because somehow this yielded a fairly successful business, right? I was doing quite well. So my head was happy because everything made rational sense. I was making money. I was living a good life. My heart was happy because I was really expressing my feelings in a way that was authentic without, doctoring it for what, might be palatable to the people on the internet, right? And everything was working out. And then at some point, I decided, I can't run my business by luck anymore. I want to have a family in the near future, which means, I was doing pretty well, but I want to make more money. So all right, I need to have a system. I need to do things a little bit more strategically. And from then on, I made a series of decisions that really messed up everything for me, or it really put my heart and mind out of sync because I'm not going to go with every single one, but essentially I ended up hiring some coaches, some consultants. I ended up working with a marketing firm. And over again, I got this advice, or I was presented with this system of from a very head-based perspective, from people who meant well. I don't have anything against them, but it was like, okay, this is how you become successful. This is how you become more successful. This is how you grow your business. This is how other people grow their business online. And every time I felt like my heart wasn't in it. I often said to them, okay, this makes sense, but there's something about this doesn't feel authentic. It doesn't feel right. And the response I always got was, oh, this is just your resistance, or this is your fear of success, or this is just something you have to push through. And this was essentially the beginning of my heart versus mind split. Because if you look at the world of personal development, or just advice on the internet, let's say, if you look at the spectrum, right, from the spiritual, more heart-centered side to the more productivity, entrepreneurship, head-centered side, you see this kind of conflict a lot, right? So one thing that, kind of exemplifies the head-centered world of advice giving is the phrase "eat the frog," right? It was a self-help book some years ago, or a productivity book, which basically the idea is whatever's the thing that's most uncomfortable for you, the frog, so to speak, you should do that first, right? Eat the frog, right? Which basically means do the thing that makes sense, even though your feelings aren't on board, even though it's uncomfortable, even though you don't feel like doing it, right? And there's many ways to confirm that that's great advice, right? People who are able to push through discomfort tend to do things that maybe other people just never do, and then the first people are more successful. But then the other end of things, the heart-centered world, you have the phrase by Joseph Campbell, "Follow your bliss," which is something that really appealed to me when I was younger, right? It made sense to work in corporate as far as living, a life that society prescribes, but my heart wasn't in it. And, this idea of following your bliss and everything will work out, which is like the implication at the end of that, that's like, that's really appealing to the heart, so that first phrase, eat the frog, is a very head-centered slogan. Follow your bliss is a very heart-centered slogan. And obviously there needs to be a balance. And we're going to talk about the fallacy of balance later in this episode, but essentially, going back to my story and what's relevant here, I was basically given the advice to eat the frog. Very often I did it because, yeah, okay, it makes sense. You got to push through your fears, put through this discomfort. And then I kind of ended up in these situations over and over again where my heart was, in a sense, I'm personifying this aspect of me or my emotions. My heart was so not in what we were doing that, of course, it wasn't successful, right? And then my heart, like, in a sense, got mad at me. And then I started making some decisions that were totally emotion-driven and in many ways irrational. Like, I took down my YouTube channel for a while and deleted my Instagram for a while. Like, a lot of things. I'm not going to go through every decision, but I did a bunch of things that, in reaction to my my head overriding my heart, my mind overriding my emotions, I went to the other direction. And like for years, I went like flip-flopping back and forth of only doing what made sense on paper and only doing what felt right to me, even though it didn't make sense. And basically, both of these things are wrong, is my point, right? If you're going from a purely head-centered perspective, you're going to find a certain kind of dysphoria that comes from perhaps inauthenticity or simply your feelings not being on board. Whereas if you're always following your heart, you're going to get yourself into trouble because there's information, there's things that your rational mind can do to prevent bad things from happening. And actually, when I left my last and only real corporate job, I decided like I'm gonna follow my bliss. I'm gonna do what feels right. I'm gonna trust the universe that things are gonna work out. And I went on this kind of bohemian spiritual adventure that maybe I'm still on in some ways, but I remember when in my early 20s, I met a lot of really cool hippies, just to give them a simple label. Really cool hippies who were much older than me, maybe in their 40s, and they lived these like incredibly dynamic, fun lives where they were always following their heart, and they're usually very, intuitive and have very interesting and, cool people, but they were all broke, right? They had lived this very heart-centered life without a head. Without like exercising their mind or like, rational planning. And they put themselves in these kind of unpleasant situations later in life. And that was kind of a signal to me that you do need both, right? You need the heartless get into trouble as much as the headless. So looking at this superficially, you can say like, oh, you need to put them into balance, right? That's kind of, I think, a superficial transactional way that, I made this comparison of the internal conflict to the external relationship conflict. That's kind of like the really superficial and not useful relationship advice that you sometimes see. And I think even certain relationship therapists will share like, oh yeah, you just need to balance things out, right? Like, sometimes he gets to decide, sometimes she gets to decide. And that's for various reasons, that's actually not very good advice. We're going to talk about the real reason a little bit later in the episode. But for one, and this is the first thing I want to get into, is that your heart and mind, even though they're sense-making mechanisms, they both are good at their own thing. They're both ways of interpreting reality to help you navigate your life. Sometimes they can get distorted. So we go back to this analogy of like, okay, one is a camera, one's a microphone. Camera lenses can get smudgy. And if you're making your life decisions based on the image that the camera gives you, but the lens is distorted and you're getting an unclear picture or an incorrect picture, and you're making your life decisions based on that, you're going to make the wrong decision. Same thing with the microphone. The microphone's distorted or whatever, you're going to make wrong decisions. So the distortions we're talking about when it comes to the mind and to the heart, the mind, so an accurate mind, an accurate camera lens, if you will, what your mind does for you, it creates a model of reality that ideally is an abstract representation that is accurate, right? Like you have a certain set of principles in your head, or you have certain beliefs about the world, an ideology, if you will, or just ways of interpreting facts and making plans. If you're deluded, right? I mean, that's what we would call a mind distortion, right? Some sort of delusion, or you're following advice that isn't real, or you're following an ideology that is an inaccurate model of reality, meaning it's not able to predict the future in a way that it claims to. You're going to make wrong decisions, right? That is a distortion on the mind level. So just a neutral example on distortions of the mind or delusions. You see a lot of fad diets come out, or fad, just things to do with your body in terms of health and fitness, because everyone wants to be more healthy and fit. And you always see these like great justifications. Like anyone who's pushing veganism or carnivore or anything, right? They have all of these scientific studies and things to point out. And those represent a mental model that if you accept it, I mean, if someone accepts it, they're hoping that if they follow this diet, they're going to get this healthy result. But as we know, like one, there maybe is no like one supreme diet, but two, you also see, I mean, there's been many fad diets that have caused people a lot of harm. Like I know someone who, when she was young, I guess her mom was like really cutting edge because somehow she was like into the keto diet, like way before it was cool, like many years earlier before anyone was talking about it. And she forced her children to eat keto, and they all developed like autoimmune issues, right? And I'm not a scientist. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not trying to, speak for or against the keto diet. I'm just using this as an example. But like, she was following her mind was distorted in the sense that the mother was following an incorrect model of reality that instead of making her kids healthier, made her kids less healthy. And you can think about this with any ideology or set of beliefs. Like if the model of reality is inaccurate, the results are going to be accurate. And if what your mind is telling you to do is based on an incorrect model, then your mind is distorted, right? If you can recognize that you're following a delusion or the mental model is not complete or is inaccurate, that's a distortion that you should not follow. Whereas on the heart side, what we would generally refer to as a heart distortion, we can label as trauma, right? A trauma is any kind of event that causes an emotional contraction where you're being affected by old emotions even later in life. So, classic example, if we think in terms of attachment theory, right? You have an insecure, let's say say a woman with a very avoidant father, right? He's totally emotionally detached and absent. She might develop some sort of anxiety around that. She might, as an adult, because, her sense of love and attachment was distorted essentially by being attached to an insecure, emotionally unavailable father, it might actually feel safer for her, or she might be drawn to emotionally unavailable men when she's an adult and dating, right? They might be the guys that are totally not good for her, but she might just be drawn to like, it might just feel good to her, even though it's not good for her, right? Her emotions, her heart has become distorted by essentially bad conditioning. So if you're like a friend with someone like that, and of course, it could happen to men too. I'm just using this one example, right? A young man, or maybe the more common version for men is a young man has an overbearing mother, develops what we would call nice guy syndrome. And, he takes this kind of subservient role or, if he was enmeshed by his mother made him responsible for emotional needs. He becomes like this ultra emotionally available, maybe spineless guy in the way that he dates in the future. And maybe he's drawn to women who are overbearing or, play the victim role a lot. And even though that's not good for him, he becomes drawn to that, right? Like that, his heart essentially has been distorted to seek not what was good for him, right? Not to have the good feels when he meets a totally secure woman, or another example, a woman who's or whatever. You meet a totally good person for you, but for some reason you're not attracted to them. You're attracted to the person that's really bad for you, right? That's a heart level distortion. But there's also a lot of other things that we might not label as trauma, but basically things that affect our emotions in a way that cause our future emotions to be distorted. So simple examples, like if you feel really ashamed about something, or if you feel a sense of loss about something or an inadequacy, you might take on some extreme behaviors in the future that aren't the best thing. Like your emotions might have this like sense of desperation that would cause you to make bad decisions. I think of, say, an investor or a poker player who takes a bad beat or takes a bad loss, and he feels really shitty. So then he starts making these like, really aggressive, irrational trades, or, he pushes his chips all in at the poker table when like he really didn't need to, but he's trying to make up for a loss he took a couple hands ago. And like, you can see this in life. Like if you feel like a failure, those are the people who tend to make particularly bad decisions because they're trying to like overcome the sense of inadequacy. Like any of these emotions that make you feel not complete or less than often cause these kind of desperate actions that usually in retrospect, or if you allow your mind to come in and be a little bit more rational, you can recognize, okay, this aggressive action is probably not smart, right? And these kinds of heart level distortions or emotional distortions are often what cause us to ignore the smarter information coming from our mind. And the opposite is also true, right? If you're following a false ideology or you're believing in a system or a model of reality is incorrect, that's usually what causes you to not listen to the good information from your heart. So like going back to my examples, right? Like there's something, I mean, I can't explain it, right? Because the heart is kind of ambiguous, right? You're not, we don't interpret our feelings the same way we interpret our conscious thoughts in terms of language. But like with all of these like business decisions, and honestly, it also bled into my personal life. I made some relationship decisions and other things like, following this incorrect model of reality, right? A lot of times it's like, oh, you just got to push through the resistance. You got to push through the discomfort. Or I was even in a relationship where it was like, I didn't really want to be in there, but I had this model of reality of like, oh, relationships are supposed to be uncomfortable. Like you're supposed to push through, or like, this is my fear of intimacy that I don't want to be in this relationship. And I stuck it out in one that like, it really wasn't good for me. And man, if I was listening to my heart, I would have exited way sooner at a much better time, or I would never enter the relationship. And like we can think of many times in our lives that we make decisions like this where our mind overrides our heart because we have an incorrect model, or the reverse is our heart overrides our better judgment because of some sort of pain or trauma typically. One example with that is I made a really bad investment last year. I invested in a friend of a friend's business. And, he showed me a bunch of things on paper that seemed to make sense. And it seemed like, I was going to get my money back in a few weeks. And, it's been over a year. I still haven't gotten my money back. I don't think he was a con man or anything, but like, honestly, if I look at everything that I saw rationally, there were enough red flags that I should have known I shouldn't have put in all that money, right? It was like a big chunk, right? I should have known. There's enough red flags of things like didn't seem totally right, but honestly, I was kind of desperate at that time of like, I really want something to work out. Like I tried a bunch of things and they hadn't worked. It's like, this seems like it kind of could work. And I was honestly, it's kind of like the poker player irrationally pushing all his chips in. It's like, I let my emotions and my excitement override my better judgment because of this pain. So all of this is to say, if you are in this internal dilemma of heart versus mind, like your thoughts want one thing, your feelings want another, the first thing you have to do is look at, are either my mind or my heart distorted, right? So for instance, looking at your heart first, looking at your emotions, if your emotions are driving you to do a specific thing or not do a specific thing, but you're in conflict, the first question to ask is, are my feelings being distorted, right? Are my feelings, is this impulse to do this or not do this, is it resistance because I'm afraid of success, as some people told me in my story, or like, this is like my self-sabotage or my fear of exposure. When you think of writer's block or Stephen Pressfield's whole thing about pushing through the resistance, right? If you really feel called to expressing something and you're inhibited in doing it and there's no good reason for it, you can kind of look at that feeling of resistance of like, okay, this is probably just a self-sabotaging feeling that is trying to keep me in a safer space or trying to keep me small because I've been conditioned to feel like, oh, I shouldn't express myself. Or if we look at like the relationship example of like, oh, am I being drawn to this type of person who's just like my last 3 exes who are all really bad for me? Is this really just like my past relationship trauma where I'm seeking what's familiar rather than what's good for me? Like you have to question these things, right? Anytime, especially if you feel a certain passion or excitement about it, is this feeling, whether it's to do something or not do something, is it possibly being driven by pain? Is it possibly being driven by a sense of inadequacy? Is it possibly being driven because I've just been conditioned, maybe at a young age, to seek something that's not good for me? And if you're an adult, hopefully you've had enough experiences of being like, okay, yeah, every time I date this type of person, I ended up miserable or heartbroken. Or every time I listen to the resistance to not share something that I feel is important, I end up feeling bad about it, right? Those are feelings, obviously, that are distortions, right? They're not feelings to follow. Especially if your emotions and your thoughts are in conflict. Like if you're looking at the thoughts, like, is this model of reality actually accurate, or do I just hope it's accurate? Or am I just putting my trust in this set of abstractions that I'm not really sure? And the obvious, way to check on something is if you look at what a certain ideology or system or model of reality says it's going to do, right? Like if you do this, you're going to do that. If you follow this diet, you will be healthy, and not only will you lose weight or have the 6-pack, like your blood work will be good. All of these like health markers, right? Like, does it actually check out? Right? Or is it just someone who's trying to sell me this idea is pointing to an example, or like is cherry picking an example, right? Because one idea that's kind of overarching that I want to get across is that both your heart and your mind, as sense-making mechanisms, want the best for you, right? They're there to help you navigate reality and live a happy and fulfilled life. So if they're fighting against each other, if they want different things, then chances are one or both is messed up. One or both isn't working the right way, at least in this situation. All right, so once you recognize and hopefully maybe cleaned out if either heart or mind has distortions, the next step in solving this dilemma is then to make sure both of them are empowered. if you think of them as personify them as like a two-person advisory board, right? Your heart tells you one thing and your mind gives you other information. Are they able to do their jobs really well, right? So we made sure they're not distorted, but both your heart and mind, they're not just magically going to be great at certain things, right? Like obviously, your mind, your sense of rationality, if it's not educated in a certain subject, right, it might not necessarily give you the right information, right? So the mind is easy to empower, right? If you want to be able to trust your ideas about something, you should know a lot about the subject. So first would be educating yourself about a given subject before you make a decision based on your ideas, if you don't know anything about that thing. But also something that I covered pretty deeply in the General Semantics series that I did, I guess it was a couple years ago now. You could look it up if you want, about de-abstraction, right? Because especially when you're presented with a lot of different ideologies or a lot of different ways to interpret reality, can you bring things down to the facts? Right, especially with like big life decisions or dilemmas, or really anything, is like it's very easy to abstract things and put things into buckets that can basically confuse your mind. So de-abstraction is one thing, and I would say maybe even a simpler way to put it is organization, which is why I do think one of the best things that I ever do, and I could very clearly see if I do this, my mind is very happy and can do what it does best. And if I don't do it, it's not, and that is journaling, right? I always have my journal on me, whenever I can. Being a father has made it a little bit harder to take time for myself to journal. But if I could just like organize my thoughts and organize my life on paper, my mind can really do what it does best. Whereas when I don't, or if I'm running from thing to thing, and not really, my thoughts aren't organized, my mind can't function properly, right? We all know what it's like to be scatterbrained, or we know someone who's scatterbrained. And it's like if you just don't lay things out, it's very hard for your mind to function properly. I love the Stephen King quote, writing is refined thinking, right? And I think he was more speaking about like writing prose, but like just journaling about your life, like writing out what is important and organizing your thoughts, and maybe even organizing your feelings using your thoughts on paper. That's one of the best things you could do for your mind, that allows your mind to function properly and make proper decisions. And it also helps empower your heart, right? Like, especially when you have a lot of feelings and conflicting feelings, if you could simply organize, if you could use your rational sense to basically organize the facts about everything, that allows your mind to function properly and allows your mind to function, serve your heart rather. And in terms of empowering your heart, this is something that, we could basically, this is what motivational content is, but I would put it down to something that, Guru Pashupati, who was on the podcast a few weeks ago or a few months ago, said, which is I forget exactly what the context was, but one of the most important things that you can do for a person is to encourage them. And I would say one of the most important things you could do for yourself or do for your own heart is to encourage your heart, because your heart, which is, is our way of abstracting like all of your emotions, right? It's very easy to get caught up in negative emotions. It's very easy for you to get caught in like, you could say resentment. It can even fall into the category of one of those emotions that kind of keeps you stuck in the past and prevents your heart from giving you proper information, right? Like a resentful heart is not a clean heart, right? A resentful heart is not an effective heart. And when we talk about encouragement, it's like, what is, when your heart can really serve your mind to go in the other direction is when you have a sense of courage. So what allows you to feel encouraged? What allows you to encourage yourself? It could, and everybody's a little bit different in this. It could be things like, some people really like words of affirmation. This is where we kind of go into the external relationship side of things of like, some people really get motivated when they hear nice things about themselves. If you're such a person, then probably positive affirmations are really useful for you, because, it's great to hear a compliment from someone else. It's great to hear a compliment from yourself, essentially, or compliment your own sense of your own heart. Personally, as far as the love languages go, words of affirmation have never really meant much to me. I guess it's just like, I don't know if it's because I'm a neurotypical dude or whatever, but like, it seems like words are so easy to fake. So even like when I've been like down on myself and, saying nice things to myself, trying to affirm myself in the mirror, like it kind of feels empty the way that if, it just in my mental model of things, it seems like so easy to fake words. Whereas things like acts of service, that takes a lot of energy. It's a lot more expensive. This is just my own personal view, right? It's a lot more expensive to do an act of service for someone, which is why those are things that have always mattered more to me. So when I think of like, how do I encourage my own heart, right? If you're a words of affirmation person, personal affirmations might be helpful. But for me, the things that make me feel good about myself and feel courageous and feel empowered allow me to have positive emotions that can fuel positive actions are basically acts of service to myself. Like, did I actually get myself up before the sun, right? That's something that it just gives me this kind of boost of like, all right, I got up before the sun. I feel good about myself. I don't feel like a loser. I feel like a winner already, right? The first act of my day, I feel good about myself. And these kinds of things essentially build your self-esteem. One of my friends, coaches, Rob Candell, he has this phrase that has always stuck with me is that self-esteem is built through esteem building acts. He might have used different words, but essentially, like, if you keep doing things that show yourself that you're worthy of respect, then you yourself will respect yourself. And I think this is the key. This is a key to encouraging your own heart. And I think, obviously everyone's a little bit different, but I do think for most guys, these kinds of hard actions matter a lot more than just saying nice words to yourself. Some men are words of affirmation people, but I do think, doing things that prove to yourself that you are worthy, that you are worthy of respect, that you are a good person, that you are a strong person. This is what encourages my heart, I'll say, and I think it's true for most men. But there's one more piece in empowering your heart, right? The encouragement's important, but in the same way that you can educate your mind to be better at something, right? Like if you're trying to trade crypto or day trade on the stock market, and you know nothing about finance, or you don't know nothing about that, then any ideas your mind comes up with are probably not going to be good ones to follow, right? Because you just don't know anything about the subject, right? So you should educate yourself. Your heart, or we could say your intuition, needs to also be trained, because I think a lot of people, especially if you're a creative or you tend to be more spiritual, you might have this sense of like, oh, I should always follow my intuition, right? I have this feeling it must be right. And when you follow intuition and it works out well, it has this kind of magical feeling of like, oh, I don't know why this was the right thing, but I did it and it turned out to be right. But as Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow points out with various case studies, a lot of people fallaciously think that their intuition is right when it's really not. And what makes an intuitive person, well, first of all, intuition is, some spiritual people will probably disagree with this, but intuition is not universally applicable, right? Like if you have no experience about something, then your intuitive feelings probably are not going to be very accurate. And this might seem like a weird example, but one of the time that I really had, I'm not trying to make a pun, but hands-on training with my intuition, when I was in One Taste, we did this practice called orgasmic meditation. It was a practice where a man touched a woman's body in a way to generate mutual sensations, right? It was a sexual meditation practice, right? And the trippy thing about it was that, as a man, you're going through this process of touching a woman's body in a certain way that you're trying to intuit what would feel best for her without having her to tell you, right? There's part of the practice was that she would give you feedback, but ultimately, to become a good stroker in this practice, you want to be someone who is so tuned in to his partner's body that he could sense what the woman wanted before she had to say anything, and ideally before she even realized it herself. Right? Like, it's kind of a mark of a good stroker if you could change how you touched a woman and she's like, wow, that's exactly what I wanted. How did you know? And this kind of thing, this is what kind of made me realize that intuition is not this kind of crazy magical thing. It is something that can be trained, right? Through doing this practice thousands of times, I had so much sensory feedback it got to the point where I would get a kind of impulse in myself, and this intuitive impulse, and I would be able to trust it with 99% confidence because I had so much feedback. I had so many reps, if you will, of doing this practice and getting a sense of what worked and what didn't work. And it's actually this kind of like joke with my wife and I, because I can always, I've developed this skill in this specific realm where I can always sense where on her body would be the most sensational. Like actually, it's a funny thing, but like her ears have always been like hypersensitive. And the first time she and I kissed, for some reason, I just like grabbed her ear, and I've never done that before, like while kissing someone, or as far as I don't remember, as far as I can remember. But my intuition, my heart, if you will, had been so trained through so many reps that I could just sense that like I could grab her ear, and there's like this running thing with us where like anytime we cuddle or we're physically intimate, like if she has like this sensitive spot, I can always find it, right? I just like can heat seek it somehow. And that came through reps, right? It's not like some magical ability I had. It was something that came through many, many reps. And actually another thing off of this that might seem, again, strange to some, something my friend Ken Blackman speaks about a lot, he's been on the podcast a couple of times, is that he actually learned how to talk to women through doing this physical stroking practice, right? He had so many reps of the sensory feedback where he can intuit what a woman was feeling in her body with very high accuracy, so that he eventually learned, if you caught my authentic flirting guide, it's one of the videos I put out a couple months ago. It's essentially this, right? It's like, it's not thinking about what to say to a person, but really feeling the person with you, really empathizing with the person, and being able to interpret that information in a way that can give you accurate intuitions on how to proceed in a conversation or a flirting exchange or some sort of physical intimacy. Like, the point of all of this is that if you want to really trust your intuition in a certain area of life, you need to have experience in that area, right? Your intuition isn't going to magically be correct all the time, but if you give yourself the reps, it will. So if you've done your best to check that your heart and mind are not subject to distortions, and you've done your best to empower both of these sense-making mechanisms for you, they can feed into each other, right? Your mind, a well-organized mind, can help you make more sense of your feelings or allow your feelings to flow in a better way. Kind of like in a way that, at least in my view of man-woman relationships, the man takes care of the physical things. He takes care of the realm, so the woman's feelings can be expressed in a way that actually is useful rather than chaotic. And vice versa, right? If your heart is encouraged, if it's feeling empowered, if it's full of positive emotions, then it can execute on the ideas or the model of reality created by your mind. Just like in a healthy man-woman relationship, and I'll say for my own relationship, when my wife is really feeling great, she makes everyone in our house feel great. And then I'm empowered to do the things that I was planning on doing anyway. Whereas, if she's not, it just becomes harder, right? Like she fuels me in that way. Your heart fuels your mind organizes for your heart. Which brings us to the last idea, the last principle for this topic, which is an idea that's kind of been my new intellectual obsession, which is this idea called synergy by Buckminster Fuller. He wrote this book, Synergetics, I think in 1972. It's a very dense book, but it's like my new intellectual obsession, as I said. If you've been following my podcast for a while, a couple of years ago, I got really obsessed with Jung, and all my episodes were about Jungian ideas, and I was reading all these Jung books, and then sometime later, I got obsessed with the ideas of Timothy Leary and Robert Anton Wilson. I was talking about the eight circuit brain a lot. Actually, by the way, I'm going to be doing another episode continuing the eight circuit model. I kind of dropped the idea some years ago, but a listener to the podcast requested that I continue on into circuit 5 through 8. So that will be coming out soon. But my new thing is this idea of synergetics by Buckminster Fuller. It's a very deep topic that covers many things, but the basic idea is you cannot tell anything about a whole or an aggregate or a collective by looking at one unit inside, right? You can't tell anything about a human body by looking at just one cell. You can't tell anything about a population of people by looking at one person. Only by looking at the whole thing can you see that there's certain things that you can see that there's certain actions that apply to all of it, right? You can't go in the other direction. And where this is relevant to us is that a lot of people, when they're talking about the heart versus mind dilemma, or maybe just our general way or our culture's mental model for looking at thoughts and emotions, is probably because of the Enlightenment. We can blame Rene Descartes for separating mind and body, or mind and feelings, let's say, is that they're actually not separate. Even though I opened the episode talking about how, the neocortex and the paleomammalian brain evolved separately, they're still part of the brain, right? They're still, again, sense-making mechanisms with the same goal of helping you navigate your life. And within the synergetics idea, there's this term that Buckminster Fuller coined called tensegrity, which is a portmanteau of tension and integrity. And he was pointing to, there's a lot of things in nature that counterintuitively hold themselves together through tension. So actually, I learned about this term and this whole Buckminster Fuller idea actually from a yoga teacher. He was talking about how the human fascia system, our fascia, our soft tissue, is actually responsible for all of our, for our posture and being able to hold ourselves together, right? It's not our bones and muscles that hold ourselves together. It's our fascia that gives us our shape. And the fascia network in the body, it creates this shape and holds itself together in somewhat, counterintuitively, by having opposing tension, right? Like your ability to stand up straight is a balance of the tension in the fascia in the front of your body and the tension in the back of your body, right? If one or the other is much stronger, if they're out of balance, that's where you have like weird postures where people have, kyphosis or lordosis, or maybe their pelvis is shifted. It's because the fascia is not in balance, right? The tension is not in balance. One side is much more tense or stronger than the other, and it causes these physical imbalances. And you can apply this to, sociology and ecosystems and physical structures and all of these things. But as far as our episode here, the heart and mind often have different ways of interpreting reality, just like a man and a woman typically have different ways of interpreting reality, but they hold themselves together through this opposite, right? Through this polarity, if you will, through this tension. And I mentioned in the beginning of the episode that balance isn't really the goal, or the way that most people look at relationships, or just keep things even or keep things balanced. That's not really what we're going for. As much as the balance, just like in the human fascia network, it has to be balanced in the sense of their balance of creating a whole together, right? They're in synergy. It's not, like I really hate the relationship advice of like, oh, just split everything, or he has his way half the time and she has her way half the time, because even if you split things evenly, you're causing mutual resentment, as opposed to we're both doing this for this reason. And in a relationship, a man-woman relationship or a polarized relationship between two different types of beings, it works best not when you make them the same. Not when you androgynize everyone. I know obviously this is my personal beliefs, but if you're listening to my podcast, then perhaps you have the same kinds of beliefs. It's like, the androgynous relationship where both partners are doing the same exact thing and acting the same way and interpreting reality the same way. That is convenient, but that's not what really draws us together, right? Relationships where everybody's, splits everything down the middle, they end up being just kind of like transactions between two separate units, as opposed to being two different parts of the same whole. And the actually unified, synergized relationship functions best when the more feeling-driven person gets to really feel her feelings, and her feelings are not only tolerated, but they're appreciated and given room to grow and, allowed to do what they do best. In the other end, I'll just use the typical hetero example, but I think this applies to any kind of romantic relationship and our internal relationship. When the more masculine side, if you will, gets to really express his thoughts, and his thoughts are valued, and his, rational decision-making is valued. And, those two things can come together, and even though they're opposite, they support each other in the opposites, right? So bringing this back to the internal thing, as I mentioned again, your mind can really serve your heart by organizing the feelings and interpreting the feelings in a way that fits into a mental model. Your heart can really empower your mind by, when it's fueled with positive emotions, you can actually do the things that you wrote down on paper. You can actually execute on your plan really well. And you have this metaphorical tensegrity where instead of one side pulling the other to the other side, right? So again, using the fascia analogy, right? Instead of like the front side of your body pulling the back side in, which obviously creates bad posture, or your mind trying to override your heart of be like, no, this is just like, these are just bad feelings. You need to do this thing, right? The way that, a lot of my bad business decisions were made, or the opposite of your heart being like, no, your ideas are stupid. Like, we just need to follow our passions. Is, can you act together, right? Just like in a relationship between a man and a woman. Can these two very different elements of your psyche feed each other rather than try to override each other or force each other, And I would say the one exception would be if you realize one or the other is very distorted, if you realize you're making emotional decisions based in trauma, your mind kind of has to convince your heart in a sense of like, okay, this is not the right way. Likewise, if you have like this strong feeling against what your mind thinks is the right thing, maybe you should look at the model of reality you have and be like, okay, maybe this is something that we shouldn't follow. And I'll end with like one more story of one of the reasons actually why this idea of synergy, which I'll talk about more in future episodes, has become so fascinating to me, is I've been riding horses recently. I've been doing some training in horse connection therapy, but also learning to ride. And I'm specifically working with horses that basically haven't been trained. Like, they're not broken in the sense that like anyone could just get on their back and ride. Like, I'm working with this one particular horse that like almost every time we ride, it's kind of a battle in the beginning. Like, I really need to like, every time I need to earn his respect. Like, he really doesn't like, I think I'm the first person to ride him in years, and he really doesn't like it. But of course, after we do some galloping, he's super happy and friendly, and he's like thrilled that we did it. But like, it's this interesting thing where And we're going to do a whole episode on what I've been learning from horse riding, but it's this interesting thing where horses, when you're riding a horse, you're becoming one being and they're kind of feeling your feelings for you. It's like almost like you as the human rider become the head who's making the decisions and holding the reins. But the horse, what's so fascinating about horses, and I think why horses are so effective in use in therapy and leadership training and many other things, is that the horse can feel your feelings better than you, right? There have been plenty of times, actually this morning, I was like really in a bad mood and I had all these negative thoughts and like these contracted feelings, and the horse showed them to me. I didn't even really realize like what a bad mood I was in until the horse just reflected. Like the horse could feel my feelings better than I could and reflect them back to me. And essentially, when riding a horse like this, when riding a horse that hasn't been broken in or hasn't had their feelings totally overridden through conditioning or training, is that if I'm going to ride this horse, if I'm going to enter synergy with this horse where we can gallop together as a unit, I need to be connected to my own heart. I need to ground myself and like be connected to my own feelings, because his feelings are going to be an amplified version of mine. Like if I want to use my rational mind to guide him and get him to, do his exercises, which my mind knows are good for him and he doesn't realize until after the fact, I also need to listen to the fact that his heart essentially is showing me something, showing my mind what it couldn't see otherwise. And I think this is like just a really beautiful metaphor that also feels concrete, because like it's not just like an abstract thing, right? I can literally see the horse gets pissed off as a reflection of me having like, negative, resentful thoughts or something, right? Like you have to have this mutual respect or attention on each other for you to act in synergy. So I hope all of this is useful for understanding and navigating the heart versus mind dilemma. The first thing being clearing distortions. A lot of people make bad decisions because heart or mind is distorted. The second thing would be empowering each, right? Making sure they both can do their job well. And the third thing is seeking the synergy, which is, again, more of a metaphor than anything, but recognizing that any impulses you have in yourself, whether you split this up as heart versus mind, as we've been doing in this episode, or split it up as archetypes or separate impulses or aspects or any model of the psyche, any abstract representation that we're using, is that recognizing all of these parts of yourself are serving the same goal. And ultimately, even though I think it's very useful to look at the different parts of the psyche and maybe personify them at times, is how can you get everything to work together? Because internal conflict is a sign that something is wrong, right? Like, and just pushing through it or just overriding one aspect of yourself. Maybe there are times where that's useful, but in general, that's not sustainable. And to live a happy and fulfilled life, you need to be in synergy. So just to actually finish the story that I opened with, because I realized I didn't conclude it, is, I had this period of time where I was allowing my mind to override my heart or allowing my heart to override my mind. And it was leading to things just not working out. Either my heart wasn't into my work or my life, or my mind was, just being overridden because I was doing just what felt good and, not planning for my family's future in the right way. And all I can say is, and I don't want to add magical thinking to this, so add whatever caveats are needed, but in the last couple months, and I would honestly say because I took some time off with the birth of my son and took some time to like really connect with my feelings, but also organize my thoughts and see where I've been making mistakes over the last couple of years, I have felt this kind of inner peace, which is, a heart-centered thing. My heart is more happy because I'm not like forcing it to do things that don't feel authentic or genuine, but also like this mental peace. And the results, I will say, even though I'm not trying to make a magical conclusion to this, is that, my heart's been feeling better because I'm actually expressing myself in a way that feels authentic again. But also my business has been doing well. Like, I don't know, I've had some really good months the last couple of months. So my mind is really happy. And it's like my mind and my heart are finally on the same page, accomplishing, even though they have different immediate goals, but the ultimate goal is fulfillment. So I hope all of this is useful. Once again, if I've been using the external relationship as a metaphor, but if your external relationship is actually something you're trying to work on, you could check out, I'm calling it the Lead by Family group program. If you're a man in a committed relationship, you can apply for that. That's the other side of it. And actually, I'm announcing it in this episode because if you want to lead your family, if you want to be the masculine in your household, you do need to connect to your inner feminine. You do need to connect to your heart in the same way. If you want to ride a horse, you want to guide the horse, you do need to connect to your own feelings first, and like that's one of the ideas. I'll share more on this on the relationship side of things in future episodes. But if you want to apply for that, that's in the episode description. Also, if you simply want to do the Masculine Archetype Challenge and possibly the ongoing cohort with group calls, that is also in the episode description. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.